Hello everyone, this is fionapollo. If all goes well, this video should be uploaded right on Indie Animation Day, which means that a whole bunch of indie projects will be getting showcased across all manner of different platforms, including right here on YouTube. So if you're a fan of the indie scene, which I'm going to assume you are if you're watching this, be sure to check them out and interact with them if there's a particular project you want to see flourish. Speaking of indie animation, I thought today would be a good time to go over a topic that can often make or break the foundations of a good story and good characters, and that is writing. So one thing about indie projects, and I mean this in the kindest way possible, because I also fall into this with my own project, is that because many of these projects are being made by smaller teams or even sometimes a single individual, which can often result in a much larger pool of ideas, concepts, scope, quality, and all of that, which I am honestly down for because I don't know about anyone else, but I'm getting a little bit sick of reboots and revivals. This can, however, mean that the writing of these projects, depending on the scale and budget and such, may have gone through fewer revisions, had less time to cook, or have been looked over by fewer people who may have had some valuable insights as to how certain aspects could be better approached. And ultimately, this can sometimes result in plotlines, settings, or character behaviors feeling as if they could have had some more room for improvement. And very often that can be detected within the first few lines of dialogue, which is why, after watching through the episodes again and knowing that we still have so much more of the story to go, I wanted to highlight just how good the writing for the current hottest indie production, The Amazing Digital Circus, is actually doing currently. If you're into animation and haven't heard of this show yet, then you must have been really touching some grass recently, which good for you. But not only has this show been a smash hit right out of the gate, but it is now also being shown on Netflix too, which is nothing short of a monumental step forward for the indie scene. While, yes, Has Been Hotel did that with Amazon Prime, that was already predetermined before the series even released, whereas Digital Circus appears to be truly shaking up some previous conceptions of indie animation's capabilities, of going from being free online to also being sought after to be made available on a major streaming service that wants in on that success. And I think what's really helping Digital Circus here is due to a variety of factors, including but not limited to the episodes not being dropped all at once and instead receiving the appropriate amount of dedication each. And when you actually look at the show itself, the production value, the genuine care put into every detail, you can see why this show has resonated with so many people and accrued such high praise despite only being 3 episodes in as of October 2024. So today, in the interest of Indie Animation Day and looking into not only improving my own writing, but maybe helping to outline how this show could be beneficial to anyone hoping to create an indie production, I'd like to do an analysis into the overarching story writing of the show, as well as take a look into each of the main cast individually. We'll be looking at strengths, weaknesses, quirks, and other such pertinences of the show itself, as well as the core personalities of the cast, their motivations, actions and reactions, and so much more. And of course, if you like what you're hearing, please consider liking, subscribing, and maybe leaving a comment about your own thoughts regarding character or story writing, whether it is to do with Digital Circus or not. I also have my own little indie project going on that is basically just me working on some short videos to do with my characters, so hey, if that's your vibe, then please take a look around. Please also note that a lot of my opinions expressed in my videos are purely speculative and not based in fact, unless evidence is given to state otherwise. And without ado, let's get to it. Oh, but first, a word from our sponsor. Now, when it comes to crafting a well-written story, depending on how you work, what helps me at least is having a dedicated workspace to get in the zone. And in my humble opinion, there is no better creative hub than your desk.
Sheesh, girl, you work like this? How goes it, folks? Bubblegum here to help talk about an exciting addition to your workspace.
And, I'm here too.
And boy, do we have the desk for you.
The FlexiSpot E9 standing desk with brushless motors is the perfect addition to making sure you don't stay hunched over a screen to your body's detriment. Look, I work full-time in an office and do YouTube on the side, so I definitely need to do a bit more standing from time to time than the average person. The E9 standing desk has an adjustable height range of 635 to 1285 millimeters with up to 4 memory presets, accommodating a wide range of people and environments to suit your needs. It also boasts dual brushless motors, which provides a stable and fast lifting experience and ensures a smooth operation. It even has a handy-dandy charging port for your phone or maybe even your ring light.
Not only that, this baby has a load capacity of up to 180 kilograms.
That is a lot of cats.
What?
45 cats to be precise. The E9 also has a smart touchscreen that features a child safety lock designed to ensure the safety of any young, small, or fuzzy members of your family. There are so many more features we haven't even touched on yet. For one thing, we have the high-quality construction, using high-quality carbon steel with a pillar thickness of 95.6mm, ensuring that you don't have to worry about rocky table legs and spilt drinks all over your devices or having to replace any busted pieces. FlexiSpot also has a commitment to lead-free and eco-friendly materials to minimize their environmental impact, and they have a staggering 20-year warranty. Yep, 20 years, you heard that correctly. That's almost the lifespan of 4 separate desks from other brands.
Such a sleek design, optimized performance, and a high rate of satisfaction. What more could you ask for in life?
You are still talking about the desk, right?
And if all that isn't enough, FlexiSpot is also having a sale throughout November, which is the perfect time to grab the E9 all for yourself.
Want a better and healthier relationship with your workspace? I wouldn't skip this one, folks.
Don't just take our word for it. Try it out for yourselves.
A link to FlexiSpot's products can be found in the video description. So, to understand the writing of the show, we first need to understand the premise, and in doing so, we also have to correlate that with how certain rules and qualities of this premise are illustrated, prioritized, and dissected within the narrative itself so that everything comes together in a way that not only makes sense to the audience in universe, but actively engages us so that we keep coming back. To start us off with the pilot, which was later renamed to Episode 1, the story follows the wacky and whimsical adventures of the player characters residing within the digital circus conducted by their AI ringmaster Kane, who ensures they have plenty of entertainment during their time there. Except, Kane's idea of entertainment doesn't seem to always align with the player's wishes. Not only that, but adventures in games usually come to an end. Our player characters, Gangle, Kinger, Zooble, Ragatha, Jax, and the newest addition, Pomni, are unable to leave from the point of them donning, as Pomni notes on arrival, a weird headset. They're more or less perpetually stuck in the circus indefinitely with no means of escape and no choice but to take part in Kane's activities. None of the players appear to be particularly thrilled with this, with Zooble especially wanting to leave the situation altogether when Kane decides that an introductory game for Pomni be swiftly devised before being carted off, and any attempts to actually communicate this to Kane appear to fall on deaf ears. Or deaf gums? Despite that though, the other player characters do their best to go about their business as usual and make the best of their situation in various different forms. The circus is touted as a place where the players are expected to find endless enjoyment and adorn themselves with a happy, can-do attitude throughout their stay. However, when Pomni enters the circus and is welcomed by her new peers, we see when she is being shown around that a failure to maintain this outlook has some very dire consequences. One player character we unfortunately don't get to meet is Kaufmo, who has abstracted into a glitchy, rage-filled monster that attacks Ragatha, causing her to glitch uncontrollably and be in unbearable pain, and forcing Pomni to witness firsthand just how dangerous this new place can be. Abstraction, as far as we are currently aware, is caused by giving into the despair of being trapped in the circus should the players choose not to comply with Kane's wishes. We then learn after this that he is the only one capable of neutralizing the abstractions, and his key form of action is to just lock them away in the basement. Something that also drives home the lack of escape within the circus is that throughout the episode, it was teased that Pomni had located an exit door and chooses to go through it, but after running through door after door in what appears to be the back rooms until eventually ending up in the void, Kane pulls her back to where she started, conceding that the exit door was fake and that he only placed it within reach because Pomni asked about one. But even he doesn't know how to leave, nor does he really seem to understand why the players would want to. As a reward, however, to the players for finishing his activity of the day that Jax, Kinger, Gangle, and an unwilling Zooble took part in, the episode ends with a perturbed Pomni slowly coming to terms with her new predicament. And I don't know about you guys, but that's already quite a lot of interesting info to work with. The first thing that becomes immediately apparent is just how much the world borrows from the idea of immersive online gaming. It very much gives me the impression that the circus is some kind of immersive VR game that went awry, much in a similar fashion and premise to something like Sword Art Online, except this one appears to be more freeform and experimental, rather than a fantasy RPG. We see this in everything from the stylization of the world in all its bright colours and simplistic objects and rendering, and even in the player character designs that are seemingly randomized, which is very indicative of that kind of gaming environment. It's also worth noting that VR is still a very experimental medium as well, and many genres within it are still being tested and explored, including elements taken from horror games, of which Gooseworks themselves is a fan of, which becomes a very prominent prominent influence in the series. The next thing that comes to mind in particular are the words absurdist existentialism. These are actually two separate philosophies that were coined following the First and Second World Wars that have more or less the same base belief that life and the world is meaningless. But where they diverge is that existentialism strives to create a noble sense of meaning, whereas absurdism, on the other hand, accepts this enforcement of meaninglessness and embraces it. While they are extremely similar, existentialism tends to have a more astute perspective, whereas whether or not meaning is found within absurdism is taken in stride in equal measure. If we want to put it in the simplest of terms, here, have a meme. What Digital Circus's premise does is that it mashes these philosophies together to form the basis of its premise. The players within the circus don't need to eat or sleep or even breathe. Nothing they do on their adventures brings any merit to them. They can't explore the further recesses of the world because there isn't anything. And Kane has been shown to try but fail to grasp this in a way that goes outside of his programming, so what's the point? Why would you choose to keep going in a place like this? Well, because the alternative is to become abstracted, which again brings us around to our absurdist existentialist philosophies. Even if they abstract, they don't necessarily die or leave the circus. Kane just banishes them to the basement. So what else can they do besides do their best to find meaning within Kane's adventures, as well as foster their own meaning with each other during their downtime? What I've also personally noticed is that the series carries a hefty amount of symbolism in regards to what is known as the dead internet theory. This is a newly formed conspiracy theory in the last couple of years that asserts the idea that automated bots are pretty much running the internet right now by manipulating algorithms and boosting search results in order to influence public perception and habits. The absolute worst place for this right now is actually Twitter, where bots are manufactured to locate specific types of posts, generate replies that incite interactions from real or other fake accounts, and basically fish for engagement as a way to generate minimal passive revenue for whoever set the bot up. If we want to keep on brand here and discuss the way it affects artists too, for example, say someone puts out a tweet asking if anyone has commissions open. Fake artist bots will reply using fake or stolen images and also send DMs in an attempt to ultimately scam someone. Another example is also someone innocently commenting on a witty post that they would wear what was said on a t-shirt, which the bots would be scanning the site for and post an instantly generated webpage to purchase said slogan t-shirt from. Back in the day, these bots were a lot easier to single out and ignore, but now they're becoming much more sophisticated to the point where not only are real people having a hard time realizing they're bots, but these bots are also interacting with each other and more or less removing human interaction from the equation altogether. While I don't think this is fully 1v1 with what is displayed within Digital Circus, Kane's insistence on pushing these adventures and hijinks onto the players definitely gives me a very similar vibe to a random bot inserting itself into a real person's online space. And once you peel back the layers of what these bots are able to do and act outside of what their programming is capable of explaining or manipulating, things start to get interesting. Overall, the first episode does a really good job of putting the pins in place for the next episode to try and knock down bit by bit. It introduces the environment, establishes the core rules of the universe, as well as the consequences for when those rules are broken, while still allowing a sufficient amount of mystery to be retained as to whether or not the rules are absolute, and whether our main cast may be able to learn and play around with it. And when we get to episode 2, this really becomes apparent. In this episode, we start to see all of these factors being ramped up in a way that doesn't just affect the players, but the NPCs and the environment as well. In Candy Carrier Chaos, following the events of the first episode, Pomni is still struggling to fully grapple with the circumstances she's found herself in, to the point where Ragatha's attempts to cheer her up and potentially foster a friendship are an uphill cause. Despite this though, Kane whisks the players away on another, much more immersive new adventure where they have to assist the Candy Kingdom, not that Candy Kingdom, by racing against some bandits to bring back a stolen cargo. After a scuffle during the truck chase throughout the Candy Badlands, which ends up with Pomni on the enemy truck, however, Pomni and the bandit leader Gummigoo somehow manage to clip through the overworld environment and end up under the map, much in the same way that you would glitch through a wall in a video game. And Gummigoo comes face to face with the base models of himself, his two bandit friends, and every other character and prop used within the adventure, causing him to have what is essentially a psychological break and question Pomni as to what exactly he is and whether or not anything he knows is real. Pomni luckily is able to talk him down and convince him to come back to the circus once the adventure is done, and once the two reunite with the other characters who were in the middle of an encounter with the fudge monster that wanted to eat the candy citizens, they all collectively left and went home, only for Kane to snap his fingers and put a swift end to Gummigoo's existence upon entry, stating that if he were to lose track of players and NPCs, he doesn't quite know what would happen. And that's quite an interesting comment, as that definitely makes me think a lot more about the dead internet theory tidbit, but it also poses the question as to just how sophisticated the AI for Gummigoo was. When we look at the background characters shown within the series, even in episode 1, a lot of them are very clearly fill-ins for actual characters. I mean, they're basically mannequins made to fulfill whatever action Kane needs them for, whether it's of patrons at a dining establishment or an excited crowd in a kingdom. But when we look at NPCs, there seems to be a variation on how immersive and lifelike they actually are. And this was even used by Kane as a bargaining chip to try and convince Zooble to come along on this one. But it does call into question how intelligent Kane's must be for him to be able to conduct everything and interact with the players so thoroughly. However, despite that, when we actually look at what happened on the gang's adventure, it wasn't exactly done the way it was supposed to, and yet Kane doesn't even seem to register that, just that it was done. Overall, I think this episode poses an interesting topic on what can be deemed as real versus what's fake. In particular, how fiction affects our reality. I personally see this as a very clever way of getting the viewer to think about how fictional spaces, characters, storylines, interactions shape our perception of the world and what we value or prioritize within it. And honestly, I think that might be one of Digital Circus's biggest appeals and why it may have struck a chord with so many people. We spend so much of our lives online now, whether it be playing games, watching movies, taking part in fan content, engaging in online discourse, but does any of this stuff actually affect our real lives? Maybe not so much physically, but it most definitely leaves a psychological footprint behind at the very least, and that can leave a mark on our subconsciousness in a variety of ways. If you want an example of this, how many of you grew up feeling bad for not playing with your toys or believing your toys had feelings after watching the Toy Story movies? And how many of you still have dregs of this mindset which bubble up to the surface every once in a while even today? It's a pretty fascinating phenomenon, and one that I think we should definitely try to be wary of when we spend too much of our time looking at screens. Komiku isn't real, but his reaction to being under the map and despair at questioning his own reality caused Pomni to sympathise with him, and judging from the reactions when this episode came out, it did the same with many other people watching as well. What I also appreciate about this episode is that despite the initial blow to her psyche upon arrival at the circus, Pomni in particular is showing that she is beginning to understand how things work within this digital world when she uses the blocks to trigger a glitch motion to rocket another truck back onto the map. And the way this was done in this episode was through the use of the three-point narrative structure, more commonly known as the rule of threes. This refers to the three elements of storytelling known as exposition, confrontation, and resolution. And this principle is extremely well executed in this instance by acting as the initial hint towards her eventual circumstance and solution during the adventure. How, you may ask? Well, it starts with Pomni falling out of bed and being ricocheted around her room after falling on a block in the beginning, and then it advances to the cargo truck hitting a piece of scenery and being pushed onto the map, to finally being used to return to the overworld. This episode also goes a long way in further establishing the character dynamics between the cast that were shown initially in the pilot. I won't go too far into these as I want to discuss the characters individually, but we do get a bit more context as to who these characters are and how many of them cope with their predicament. Ragatha seems like a happy-go-lucky mum friend type who compulsively checks on others and goes along with the adventures to stave off her own apprehensions. Jax is an ass, which is hilarious considering the way people interpreted his character in the pilot despite almost nothing about it changing. I actually did a whole video on fandom interpretations of characters a while ago, by the way, with a focus on Jack's fandom reception in particular, so please check that out. Gangle is Jack's butt monkey, more or less, and is probably the person we know the least about right now, and Kinga, having been around the longest, is just really not all there. But oh, don't worry, because we get to look into that a lot more with episode 3. Now, this episode really got me intrigued for a whole bunch of different reasons, but to start off, in The Mystery of Mildenhall Manor, the gang are shooed off into another adventure of Kane's making. This time, it's a ghost hunt within a haunted mansion, but as per usual, Zooble wants no part in it, despite Kane's desperation for them to join, to the point where this adventure appears to have been explicitly designed to appeal to Zooble in particular. Regardless, the gang proceed without them, leading Kane to seek Zooble out in order to try and get to the bottom of it. While doing so, it's clear that Zooble makes no progress with getting Kane to understand why they're unhappy, and any attempts to explain are rebuffed, except for one in which Zooble says that no one likes Kane's adventures. And Kane begins to ruminate on how creating adventures are his purpose, and not being good at doing so puts his own existence into question and causing the circus around them to become undone until he eventually returns to his usual zany self, which is very, very interesting. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Pomni and Kinga are split off from the others and play along with the horror-themed plotline they find themselves in, despite the terror of it, from listening to the tapes left by a dead man, being chased by a frankly horrifyingly designed ghost head, to being tossed into, quote, hell and getting possessed when they attempt to leave. All of this eventually has Pomni reeling and breaking down, questioning why she keeps experiencing nightmare after nightmare, and who is it who's able to talk her through it? To everyone's surprise watching, Kinga seems to become more lucid and explains that he does so in the dark, and then also goes on to inform Pomni that he had a wife in the circus who too abstracted, but remained calm when Kinga sat with her in the dark until she was moved to the cellar. After this, a renewed Pomni and Kinga worked together to escape and finish the last leg of their horror-themed adventure, rejoining Ragatha, Gangle, and Jax, who got to go down the easy route for once. So remember the rule of threes we mentioned before? Well, here we are again with the third episode, only this rule of three differs slightly to the typical exposition, confrontation, and resolution that I mentioned before, and in fact, this rule can apply to a lot of different things. It can just signify the beginning, middle, and end of a journey. It can be a trio of protagonists with their own distinct personalities, but here, we're seeing this being implemented via character interactions. And no, this isn't to do with Pomni interacting with someone to learn a lesson about the world around her, like with the other episodes. Though that is probably another way that you could interpret it, it's actually focused on Kinga. If you look at Kinga's introduction versus this latest episode, in episode 1, he's just referred to and behaves like a crazy old coot who has been in the circus so long it's affected his sanity. In episode 2, we actually have an interaction between him and Ragatha, which implies that this isn't the case, or at least not always. And finally, in episode 3, we have this proven to us front and center. The exposition was Kinga's initial appearance, the confrontation is Kinga's conversation with Ragatha, and the resolution is that Kinga is in fact not as crazy as everyone thinks he is. This is how you create intrigue and mystery around a character while still leaving room for more exploration further down the line, and it's honestly quite brilliant. Okay, so that's enough of the characters for now, but I did just want to home in on something interesting that Kinga says to Pomni in this episode as well. 7 years of computer science. That, alongside Pomni's knowledge from the previous episode, immediately makes me think that the exact group of players chosen to enter the circus may not just be random, but are in fact people who are specifically more knowledgeable about computers, the digital space, and similarly adjacent subjects than we might have initially realized. For all we know, Kinga himself could have been instrumental in the creation of the digital circus itself before being trapped inside. You know what, the more I think about it, the more I think this show might be influenced by The Matrix, maybe? I honestly don't know whether that's the case or not, so, don't quote me on it. For the most part, what I understand of Gooseworks' thought process is mostly from an interview found on Cartoon Brew shortly after the pilot launched. I'm a big fan of really old 3D stuff from the 1990s and early 2000s, where it looked kinda bad and creepy, but was also completely unrestrictive creatively. They'd just have weird shapes and eyeballs flying around just because they could. And I like that kitschy vibe. Also, can I just say that the horror elements in this episode were actually executed really well, while still retaining the comedic moments and balancing them appropriately? Like, okay, it's tropey, but so is most horror-focused stuff, to be honest. Horror is best executed when it's not the single most important aspect, in my opinion, because that's when you expect it, and that in itself becomes its undoing. A little bit is always better than too much, in my opinion, especially when it comes to horror. But hey, regardless, this episode was a really good third one to cap things off on so far. We still have so much more to learn about the world, but the show is doing a great job of giving just the right amount of information, character development, emotional connection, and so much else that it really keeps you coming back for more. But we still have some key things that are still yet to be answered. Why exactly are the players trapped in the circus? What happens to the real bodies once they're abstracted? And what is the aim of the circus if nothing done there is of consequence? And I think what we've been given so far is enough to, at the very least, speculate on some of these. I personally think that all of the characters are a part of some kind of computer science program and are being used as test subjects to see whether they can be permanently kept inside of a digital space. However, if the brainwaves or something similar become too erratic or abstract, it's effectively the same thing as their brains being fried. But of course, I could be wrong. With that said, I've spoken quite a bit about the episodes and the overarching plot, so why don't we move along to the next most important aspect? What is the deal with all these characters? One thing I do really want to praise about this show is that it does a stellar job of handling a decently sized cast while both making sure they all stand out in different ways, but also work together pretty harmoniously. And by harmoniously, I don't mean that these characters are all holding hands and singing Kumbaya, no. What I mean is that their personalities and interactions with each other in the context of the narrative and their respective roles within it work very smoothly. There is friction, understanding, empathy, and irritation in all the places they're supposed to be. Honestly, out of any character, I think the only one I don't have all that much care for is Bubble. I just don't really understand why Bubble is around when we have Kane. They're both AIs, it just seems a little bit unnecessary. What also helps is that no one's personalities are too similar or outlandish compared to everyone else's. Yes, we have our archetypes of shy person, edgelord, mum friend, but given the show's direction, that's not unexpected, neither is it always a bad thing to have those. As well as that, these particular personalities make sense in terms of the character's circumstances, how they react to them, and how their own distinct personalities influence their decisions and actions. For example, to start things off, let's talk about Ragatha. When we meet Ragatha, she immediately takes on the responsibility of reassuring Pomni that everything will be okay, and it even shows her around the circus to try and foster a positive impression. And even when things go south with Kaufmo abstracting, she tries her best to assure Pomni that she isn't mad when Pomni runs away from the scene. We also see this behaviour continued throughout the second episode, despite Pomni not initially being receptive to it after everything she experienced the first time around. Ragatha still spends a decent portion of the adventure trying to ensure Pomni has fun and then worrying about her when they get separated. As I mentioned before, Ragatha strikes me as the type of person to take care of others as a way of coping with her own feelings on the situation. She's a compulsive caretaker who wants to make sure people are okay, and Pomni, being the newest addition and being someone who looks constantly traumatized, is more or less the perfect object for Ragatha's efforts. This is also very cleverly written into her design of being a ragdoll, not just because Gooseworks apparently has an obsession with the Raggedy Ann movie, but because several times now in the show, Ragatha has gotten physically hurt pretty badly during adventures or confrontations, and yet she continually brushes this off for the sake of those around her, which is very similar to how people tend to play with ragdolls, only to discard them when they grow up. And maybe I'm reading too much into the ragdoll thing, but having some characters rebel against her coddling could very well become a narrative device later on. It's also implied that Ragatha is putting on a brave face as a way to keep herself tethered, and this is even reinforced by Gooseworks outside of the show, who notes that Ragatha can sometimes say things she doesn't mean if she thinks it'll ease tensions. In short, Ragatha's role within the circus seems to be of the peacekeeper, and from this, we can discern a few other aspects of where her role might be headed. Personally, I think it's pretty obvious that Ragatha uses her own need to look after people as a form of control over her situation, and her focus on Pomni's well-being in particular really shows that when you look at how she interacts with others. With Jax in particular, the two are constantly at odds when it comes to how to approach various situations, especially when it comes to the adventures. Where Jax wants to lash out and cause chaos for his own enjoyment, Ragatha wants to maintain order and play along happily with the circus's facade for the sake of everyone else, which gives us an interesting individualistic versus community-oriented dynamic between them. I can very much see this potentially paving the way for her to give in to this I know what's best for everyone attitude when the stakes begin to heighten, and the group are forced to make certain choices for the sake of their own survival. If we want to go back to that idea of finding meaning, Ragatha definitely strikes me as the textbook existentialist by ensuring, whether consciously or unconsciously, that her acts of kindness are remembered by her friends and impact them even after she may well eventually abstract herself. Though one thing I have noticed with her is that this behaviour is only really exhibited towards Pomni, which, may just be a case of Pomni being the main character, but this is where I become a little bit confused on her, because even though we've heard her described as nice by other characters, it strikes me that she only seems to take on this caretaker role for players who are new to the circus. We don't really see her caring all that much for other characters, like Gangle, for example. Gangle is arguably the player character we know the least about just yet. What very little we do know about her is that she is a shy and reserved character with two different sides to her emotions, represented via her comedy and tragedy masks, the former of which is consistently broken in every episode as a recurring gag. When Gangle wears her comedy mask, she is happy-ish, but generally pretty quiet, and when she has on her tragedy mask, she becomes a lot more emotionally unstable and talks as if she's constantly on the verge of tears. I'll be completely honest, because Gangle is the character we know the least about and who appears to be just a punching bag for Jax effectively so far, I'm not particularly whelmed on her yet, as it hasn't really been made apparent exactly how she plays into the group dynamic, simply because the only character she's really had that much meaningful interaction with is Jax, who more or less just bullies her for laughs. She kind of fades into the background for me, which, if we were given some more shots cut to her watching events unfold, or if we had a few more interactions between other characters than just him, I'd like her more probably, but for the most part she falls quite flat in my opinion. However, this is still a space for speculation, so what can we glean from Gangle in terms of how she ended up at the circus and her goals while staying there? Well, I think Gangle's main goal really is pretty simple. She seems to want to just survive through the day without any major hiccups, and for the most part she is succeeding in that by keeping to herself and letting the more bold personalities take front and center. I find it quite interesting, however, that out of many characters, she hasn't really given into despair yet, despite her being the object of a lot of Jax's volatile tendencies. Maybe she's secretly just very spiteful, and that is how she's staving off abstraction. Maybe she knows more than she lets on, but chooses to stay quiet. Or maybe she's actually an NPC, I don't know. Nah, I doubt that too, but it would be a funny thing to throw in. As for how exactly Gangle ended up at the circus, if we want to keep going with my theory of the players being part of some kind of Matrix-esque science program, considering outside of the episode that Gangle has been confirmed to be an anime fan, I'm half tempted to believe that the players were tempted in by some kind of incentive that preyed upon people who craved enrichment maybe. All of these characters seem to strike me as kind of like outcasts who would be drawn to a digital world as kind of a form of escapism. But yeah, generally speaking, I think Gangle is my least favourite character currently because we simply just don't know that much about her yet and what precisely motivates her. However, I am aware that we are only 3 episodes in and not everyone has had their moment yet, so maybe we just need more time before making any ultimate judgment calls. That said, a shy or absent character can work in certain ways as a method of building intrigue or mystery, but I think what works to Gangle's detriment is that this doesn't really ever happen. She still engages with the adventures, she is still very much a part of the group, she just hasn't had her chance to shine yet. If we want to look into a character who still has a draw even with limited screen time compared to others, at least until the most recent episode, then I think we need to talk about Zooble next. Now, Zooble is a very intriguing character for sure because they take the complete opposite approach to the others and actively distances themselves from Kane's adventures, wanting to have no part in them. Zooble is a character who very much goes against the grain of how we expect the players to cope with their current circumstances. Where the others try to go along with Kane's adventures in an attempt to placate him, Zooble actively opts out of them and does their own thing. As well as that, Zooble is also more abrasive in personality compared to all the others as well, even Jax, who despite wanting to mess with everyone and everything, still tags along and does his best to have fun in his own messed up way. Up until the latest episode, we weren't really given much context as to why Zooble acted this way, other than just having a more don't give a damn attitude and using that as their own way to cope with being stuck at the circus. But recently, we've actually been given this needed context that provides another side to Zooble's personality and role within the story. What I find really fascinating is the way that Kane reacts to Zooble's disinterested attitude. Kane appears to become almost desperate for Zooble to express some modicum of interest in his adventures, to the point where eventually they both try to talk it out, despite Kane obviously having some difficulty grasping Zooble's side of things. As it turns out, not everyone can just shut themselves off to what is happening to them. Not everyone can ignore that they've been ripped away from a previous life and forced to play the role of someone else in a new setting and even a new body. And honestly, this was even hinted at in the pilot episode when Zooble greets Pomni on arrival, stating, "Welcome to your new home and your new body." It's revealed in the latest episode that Zooble struggles a lot with who they are within the circus and is constantly grappling with their sense of self. And because of this, their own body within this digital world is a reminder of it. And they hate it so much that it impacts their ability to think of anything else, let alone gallivanting off on silly adventures. To Kane's credit, he did try to help, but swapping out different parts of a body doesn't eliminate the core issue of the body itself being a reminder of what is missing and what they potentially long for. And with this, I just really have to praise the way in which the show goes about Zooble's personal crises, because it can of course be read in multiple ways. For example, one of which could just be missing home and wishing you could go back to your old life and memories, and a more on-the-nose reading of it is to do with body dysmorphia, or even body dysphoria. It can be one of the two, or even both, where no matter what, Zooble feels like they are pretending to be someone they're not, and it is dealing a very difficult blow to their psyche. This, combined with Gangle and potentially Ragatha, I'm starting to feel like the people selected to be the players here all seem to have a lesson to learn about what they're searching for in the digital realm, and also what they're running from in the real world. And maybe that's the key to their escape. I'm still kind of passing out what Zooble's personal meaning might be. Maybe it's just to come to terms with their own sense of self or something similar. Maybe it's to finally unravel the secrets of the circus and give the others an out. Only time will tell. Moving on though, let's speed along to Jax. Now, Jax is a fun character to look into, and that's not even just due to his personality in the show itself, but also in part due to the absolute shitstorm that arose when the second episode rolled in after the pilot. In the pilot, Jax was shown to be a chipper, mischievous kind of character who reportedly is up to do anything, adventure or no, as long as it entertained him, regardless of whether or not this was at the expense of a player, an NPC, or otherwise, which honestly kind of fits his appeal. And people were very receptive to this kind of personality because, well, it provided the right amount of contrast to the other characters in a way the audience could laugh about and appreciate. Where things took a turn though, except not really, was when this was cemented in the second episode with Jax wanting to commit acts of violence, such as using a gun and being progressively more sour about the fact that he couldn't create as much chaos as he wanted to. And when I tell you there was a gigantic fallout from this, I mean it, and I'm honestly still confused about what people expected. Though, actually, thinking on on it. I think a lot of that probably has something to do with how my generation grew up with cartoons that used violence as a medium for comedy, whereas a lot of kids who came after us didn't. They were kind of reinforced that violence was in fact bad. We didn't get that. Like, I know that one of Jax's main inspirations is Poppy the Performer, but I'll be completely honest and say that I've never really seen those shorts. However, I do feel like he shares a lot of similarities to the characters from the Looney Tunes, especially Bugs Bunny, and if you know anything about the original Looney Tunes, which began in 1930, you'll know that those cartoons were insanely violent, and the characters were choked, shot, pushed off cliffs, and pretty much downright tortured and killed every which way you could think of. So as a result, I feel like part of Jax's appeal across several generations and the distinct reaction to that personality staying consistent is tied more or less to people's familiarity with these two franchises. But no matter which way you interpret that, what I do like about Jax is that he is an incredibly good foil to multiple different characters and how they react to things. Especially Ragatha. Jax's mischief and snark has a way of getting to people and drawing out conflict as a method of providing us with more characterization alongside progressing certain plot points forward. And this is clearly shown in both episode 1 and 2 with how he somewhat manages to dictate the way Kane's adventures end. And in a sense, I kind of have a feeling that's how he ended up in the circus too. He does seem the edgy type to encounter a sinister or otherwise cursed headset and just put it on for the sake of it. Maybe. I don't know. However, despite that, it's already been hinted that Jax's volatile character is pretty indicative of his personal issues relating to being trapped at the circus. Instead of internalizing it like Ragatha, hating himself like Zubul, or dwelling on his newfound trauma like Pomni, Jax's outlet is more external, and unfortunately, the other players and NPCs bear the brunt of his antics. He projects in a way to let off steam, and to be honest with you, if I was stuck in a digital world, I'd probably want to destroy everything in sight too. Regardless, what I can say about this is that Jax's motivation for the most part is to be seen and heard. It's almost like he wants people to know how much he wants to mess things up as a form of petty rebellion, and it may well go somewhat of the way towards stoking curiosity as to how far they can take things. It'll be fun to see. Maybe him and Pomni will team up after he realizes that she figured out how to glitch out of the map, or maybe taking his mischief too far will be his undoing. Who knows? And on the subject of undoing, let's move right along to Kinga. Kinga. The resident crazy old kook. At least that's what we all believed until the most recent episode. Before we get to that though, when we were first introduced to Kinga, resident crazy old kook was the general consensus of the rest of the circus goers. He's reportedly been at the circus the longest, so it makes sense that the monotony, repetitiveness, or the constant reminder of what could happen if you lose yourself can somewhat impact a person's mental state. It's honestly kind of amazing that all the characters are as well adjusted as they are currently given the circumstances, let's all be honest. Though the thing about being insane, which seems to directly combat this perception of him, is quite literally the existence of the abstractions. We have a very clear indicator of what happens when players do in fact go too far off the deep end, and not only that, Kinga displays several moments of lucidity in which he speaks coherently, has valid ideas on how to progress in adventures, and can even offer nuggets of advice or reassurance to those going through struggles. And when we learn more about him and what he's been through in episode 3, it only makes that much more sense as to why he behaves the way he does, because doing so helps to mitigate those negative aspects of life in the circus and allows him a way to focus on the things that matter, those being the memories of his wife. Going back to the whole rule of 3 thing we had going on before, Kinga's mental state is also a really great example. The exposition being him going into his pillow fort in the first episode, confrontation being the fact that he's coherent enough with a bucket over his head to have a conversation with Ragatha, and resolution being when he talks with Pomni and discloses a part of his life with Pomni while sitting in the darkness. If we also want to revisit the idea of escapism with these characters, we have another interesting nod to that in which being shrouded in the dark is when Kinga comes back to himself, rather than being subjected to this role of the resident crazy person, almost like an allegory for things like trauma, loss, mental health, coping mechanisms, and other similar things. I think when we bring his wife into the equation with that, it can almost be read in the sense that she and Kinga were able to make the best of the circus together up until she abstracted, which ultimately shattered this illusion of normalcy within it. And yet Kinga tries desperately to cling on to it. Kinga is honestly a fantastic character in that respect, as he can be an allegory for so many things. Going back to my theory as well on the whole Matrix thing, Kinga and presumably his wife being the longest residents of the circus, in addition to his knowledge of how things work in the digital plane, and also his little comment of 7 years in computer science mentioned previously, leads me to believe that they might have been pretty instrumental in the creation of this space. The place may well have been a way for them to specifically escape the pains of the real world and indulge in a fantasy together. The more I'm thinking about it, the more I think that's what happened. Kinger and Queenie built the digital circus as a truly immersive game where you can escape real life, but somewhere along the line, the game worked too well, and the exit malfunctioned, so now they're stuck with no way out and no way to tell other people not to enter, and thus results in new victims periodically entering. Despite all this though, I'm gonna say that for now, Kinger's goal is probably similar to Gangle. It's to survive another day, but with the added context thanks to what Ragatha said in the first episode about trying to achieve an unattainable goal being the thing that sent him ever so slightly off kilter. And on the subject of off kilter, this is where I'm going to segue into discussing Kane, the AI ringmaster who keeps this digital world spinning. Now, Kane is arguably the most instrumental aspect of the circus, being the one who conducts the adventures and keeps everyone where they should be, both player, NPC, and abstractions alike. His role is to keep everyone engaged, come up with ideas for adventures, and ensure there is never a dull moment from his pre-programmed digital enjoyment. And he definitely fits this role. He's zany, kooky, and has a somewhat unpredictable personality where everything he does is exaggerated. Even when, for example, he's trying to be shifty in the first episode at the mention of an exit door. And this honestly makes a lot of sense because it's basically his job to be over the top and keep people guessing as to what's truly going on. But the thing is, despite him doing all of that, he is still just an AI. A very well-built AI, but still an AI. And once you begin to recognize his patterns, his behaviors can begin to make sense very quickly, though it can be easy to forget when placed against a lesser AI such as Bubble, which, now that I think of it, I think Bubble's main purpose here is to divert attention away from Kane just being a more sophisticated bundle of code as a way to bolster and reinforce his position as the man in charge. That said, I'm not unconvinced Kane isn't a type of learner AI who is trying his best to expand upon his own programming for the sake of his purpose, which is to entertain. And that is where our discussions of purpose are flipped on their heads, because in contrast to everyone else in the circus who have all had their purpose stripped from them, Kane has a purpose that is still very much intact for the most part. He creates adventures, he ensures the players are enjoying themselves, and it's that assertion by none other than Kane himself that becomes such a startling realization during therapy time with Zubul when the latter tries to make him understand that he is failing in that regard. And as Kane's sophisticated programming tries to reconcile with this, it just doesn't appear to have the capacity to do so yet, and when he tries, not only does he begin to unravel, but so does the entire digital landscape around him. This is also compounded when we look at how desperate he is for Zubul in particular to join in on the adventure of the day, even going so far as to construct one that he specifically thinks they will enjoy and even name-dropping them within it. This obsessive attitude towards ensuring the players follow along with his endeavors, to me at least, is indicative that he was programmed to purposefully bring a player's attention away from any kind of negative feelings or actions in favor of focusing on the positives, even if those positives are falsely manufactured. And in a way, I think this may well also play a role in the player's abstraction as well. What I'm starting to now theorize is that not only do players' own psychological states influence their abstraction, but I have a feeling that Kane might too to some extent, but I honestly can't fully explain the thought process on that just yet, so we'll put a pin in that. What I will say is that Kane's general demeanor and tendency to divert attention away from the darker aspects of the circus gives us the perfect means of introspection once we are able to look past that and dissect the world in a more literal sense. Granted, I do believe this will be a combined effort, as it was very clearly Zubul who was the one to give Kane his mini existential crisis, but there's one other character we have yet to talk about who has managed to do just that. So finally, we reach our protagonist, Pomni. Pomni, as the de facto newbie and bringer of change which instigates the start of the series, gives me the initial impression of someone very unassuming. She's a nervous wreck who has to be coaxed out of her room following a traumatic introduction to the circus and all that staying there entails. She often flits between very melancholy and very animated depending on the circumstances, which of course makes sense because she is the lens in which we view, learn and understand the digital circus. Pomni is not someone we would initially expect to be suddenly figuring out how this world works and giving NPCs the gift of existential dread, and yet more than anyone else, she seems to be the one putting the pieces together and potentially being the key for everyone to band around. Though that's not to say that others haven't tried before her, which is very likely the case with characters such as Kinger or Jax and maybe even Ragatha, though we can't really say for sure just how long the others have been trapped before she came along, so maybe after a while they just decided to give up and accept their lot. Maybe Pomni arriving and things suddenly being questioned is entirely a coincidence. I do find it strange, though, that she is the first person to ask if an NPC could be brought back to the circus, considering Kinga and Ragatha are reportedly the oldest residents, and yet Ragatha herself mused if such a thing was allowed. But, regardless. I believe that Pomni's purpose within this landscape is ultimately to understand, both for her own benefit as a character within the world, but also in the metaphysical sense of giving the viewer a way in which to see how the events of escaping the circus will play out. Not only that, her drive to understand isn't only in regards to the world in some desperate ploy to leave, but also in a concentrated effort to find connection and community with the other players and even the environment. She empathized with Gummigoo and wanted to help him despite being an NPC. She wanted to better understand Kinga and his plight regarding memories and darkness, and she wanted to understand everything that Ragatha did to look out for her. And in doing so, her empathy and willingness to learn are her biggest strengths as a character. You know how people go on and on and on about strong girl characters not having to be overpowered muscle fighters to earn that strong moniker? Well, this is what they mean. There's a reason why Pomni as a character is so beloved, and I can clearly see why. Regarding how she came to enter the circus, I have a feeling it was probably similar to what I mentioned about Jax. She came across a headset and, despite any preconceived misgivings, puts it on anyway. As for where I think her character is headed, I think that's quite a loaded question for the main character, since we can already guarantee that whatever horrible fate might befall the others, she likely either won't succumb to it or be fully affected for very long. As for what that might actually entail, however, I will leave that up to the rest of you to speculate. So yeah, I've been talking a lot. Final thoughts are that if they keep it up with the writing the way that they have, I'm very optimistic that even with the issues I've raised, which is mostly just due to the lack of focus on certain characters who haven't been all that plot relevant yet, Digital Circus will very much continue to make waves in the indie scene. I'm really glad a show like this is being made, because not only is it showing people what indie animation, or really just animation, can achieve given the right circumstances, but it's also just a reminder that art doesn't have to conform to a certain standard. It doesn't have to be censored, and sometimes what people need is something fresh to act as the perfect storm of motivation to kickstart a whole movement. Speaking of which, as today is Indie Animation Day, I just wanted to give a short shout out to a couple of series, studios, and people who are really striving to make things happen. All of which are creating really interesting and unique projects that you may well enjoy just as much as the larger projects like Digital Circus. I've been doing my best to highlight specific indie projects, mostly via my indie animation highlight shorts a while ago, but I did have to stop that due to how much work it was making for me, and honestly, one of the key draws of being indie is that you can choose to not give in to crunch time or crazy deadlines. This isn't a corporate space, it's a community of passionate individuals who want to make works on their own terms. Firstly, I wanted to shout out Shockwave Animation Studios, as they are working on a whole bunch of really cool projects such as Defenders of Elodia and the Animation Station, which had its first episode not long ago and is a really fun take on the talk show gone wrong avenue of storytelling. The studio is doing some pretty great things and they deserve all the support they can get their hands on. Also, fun fact, Millie Martins, the host of the series, is voiced by Lakira Porter, who is also the voice actress of Mint and Friends' very own Sorbet, which, if you're curious about how Mint and Friends is going, then I'm happy to report that production on both Sorbet and Cherry's intro shorts are well underway with being animated. However, it's unlikely they'll be out before the end of this year, as I've had to take some time to prioritize my health and bills. Luckily, things are on the mend though, thank God, but I appreciate everyone's patience. In the meantime, Mint's short has been out for a while now, so please go check that out. I'll link it below. As well as that, there are just so many projects that are revving up at the minute to shoot their shot and pursue their stories, such as The Ebony Witch by Poppyhin, whose Kickstarter actually goes live on the 18th of this month and looks at the story of a witch called Bonnie who goes on a mission to overthrow a kingdom and bring magic back to her world. We also have Pieces of Powder by Ko, a 3D slice of life that focuses on the effects of unaddressed mental health issues while growing up. Ko was actually able to create the whole first episode by themselves and has managed to meet their Kickstarter goal to fund at least a season's worth. Finally, I wanted to draw attention to Olin Rogers, the creator of Final Space, who also went and created his own indie story known as Godspeed. He's already been highlighted by Glitch Studios themselves, but following an interview with the creators, Olin has teamed up with Kickstarter to take on a consultation gig for the next 4 months, starting from November, to help aspiring indie animators to figure out how to organize and take the first steps towards funding their passions. What's really inspiring about this is how these guys are frontrunners in the indie scene, and yet they are still showcasing such a willingness to bolster the rest of the community that it just really makes me happy to see, you know? So if you're interested in that, then get in touch with Olin or Kickstarter and see how they can help you. With all of that said, we have finally come to the end. If you're still around, then thank you so much for watching, and I hope you not only found the discussion around Digital Circus entertaining, but also found some intrigue with the indie projects I mentioned, because we wouldn't have something like Digital Circus if not for these kinds of community-led environments that foster them and allow them to strive to be the best that they can be. I'm really glad I could manage to put out a video like this around this time, because this month month also happens to be my channel's 4-year anniversary, so it feels like a lot of cool things are coming together here. This year has been very up and down, but one thing I can say for sure is that I've grown a lot as a person who is more sure of how they want to proceed online. I'm finding that a more relaxed schedule with longer videos works for me, and I couldn't be more grateful to all of you for sticking around, whether you've been here from the start or are just watching this in passing right now. Thank you for all of your support, and I wish you all a very good rest of your day. And as always, an immensely huge thank you to my patrons who help support me. Thank you to my YouTube peeps, Jesse Sparks, Manuel Legzon Gonzalez, Ash Valentine, Lauren R, Mystic Mind, and Pedanticat. And an extra special thank you to my indie production supporters, Morgan LaFade Thin, Matty A, Kiyoshi, Roundcat, and Inside Chaos. If you'd like to become a patron yourself, a link to my page will be down below. Stay safe everyone, and I will speak to you next time. Bye!